Well, I think it's recording. Welcome. The first thing I'm going to do is to share my screen with you. There we go. So welcome. This is the Consciousness and Introspection Summer School, and it's put on by the Moscow Center for the Consciousness Studies at the State University of Moscow. And I'm very pleased to be here. I'm sitting in my house in Canberra in Australia because of COVID and many other things. I can't come to Russia or to Riga actually to do this, but I'm happy to be here doing it anyway. So let me begin by saying something about who I am. So my name is Daniel Stoljar, and that's my email, daniel.stoljar@anu.edu.au. I'm a professor in the School of Philosophy, the Department of Philosophy here at the Australian National University. And I was educated many moons ago now at Sydney University here in Australia, and at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the US. I work mainly in philosophical issues about the mind, what's called philosophy of mind, in particular philosophy of consciousness. I'm also interested in language and intentionality, and I'm also very interested in questions about philosophy itself. What sort of subject philosophy is, whether it can make progress or not, and so on. As regards the topic of these lectures, I'm actually working at the moment on a book for OUP, Oxford University Press, on introspection, and another book. Maybe it was a mistake to agree to both of these books, but anyway, I'm also working on another book, which is a sort of a debate book with Amy Kind, who's a philosopher at Claremont McKenna in Los Angeles, and that's a book for Routledge on the nature of consciousness. So both of the topics are things that I'm currently working on, and in that sense, I'm very interested in hearing your reactions to anything. You can help me make things clear or not. That would be great. Okay, let me then turn to our two topics, consciousness and introspection. Well, the first thing to say is that these topics are extremely confusing. It's extremely hard to figure out what it is that we're talking about when we talk about consciousness and introspection. And many people mean many different things by these terms. Different people, even in quite close traditions, mean remarkably different things by words like consciousness and introspection. And even if you figure out what it is that you're talking about when you talk about consciousness and introspection, there are many different questions that you could ask about them. Questions that have different logical character, different epistemological character, and so forth. So we can't deal with all of the things that go under the labels consciousness and introspection, and we can't certainly ask all of the questions we might be interested in asking about those things. Instead, I'm going to be interested only in some of the things that are meant by these terms, and only some of the questions that we ask about these things. But to give you a sense of where we're going to be going, for us the sort of key issue is really that knowledge of consciousness, which as we'll see means knowledge of consciousness by introspection, by a certain method called introspection, that idea seems to elude what you might think of as standard epistemological models. So our knowledge of consciousness seems to be different in important ways from what you might think of standard pictures that we have of how we come to know about the world. In this sense, it's not unlike other areas that seem epistemologically sort of anomalous. They seem different from the way in which we come to know about other things. An obvious example might be knowledge of morality, perhaps. We sort of somehow know that things are right and wrong, but the question is, how do we know that? That's a difficult question. Likewise, with semantic knowledge, we know that we mean certain things by certain words. Let's say, how do we know that? Somewhat difficult. The similar issue arises in the case of knowledge of consciousness, and that's really the thing that I'm going to be focusing on, the sense in which knowledge of consciousness seems to be different, where our epistemic access to consciousness more generally seems to be different from our epistemic access to other sorts of things. In this sense, the issue about epistemology of consciousness is somewhat analogous to the more traditional issue about the metaphysics of consciousness. We know that consciousness doesn't seem to fit into a sort of at least a version of a worldview that many people want to adopt, namely a physicalist or materialist worldview. I'm going to be not talking about that directly, though what I will say has an impact on it. But here I just wanted to note that in a certain sense, consciousness seems anomalous, not just with respect to a metaphysical view, a metaphysical view about what the world is like, but also with respect to a kind of standard epistemological view about what the world is like. And that's the sort of issue that we're going to be looking at. That is, whether knowledge of consciousness eludes sort of a standard epistemological model. So let me say something about the structure of the course. I've sent you a schedule and some readings. I'm sure that you've had a look at those. If not, email me and I can send them to you again. There's going to be 8 lectures. This is the first one, called Theories of Introspection. And as you can see, 4 of the lectures are on particular topics: theories of introspection, introspection and transparency, introspection and revelation, introspection and delusion. And 4 of the topics are lectures in which we're going to look at particular papers or texts. So the second lecture, for example, focuses on a famous paper by Shoemaker, and similarly with Evans and Lewis and Martina Nieder-Rumelin. So in a certain sense, you can think of these 8 lectures as falling into a set of 4 pairs: lectures 1 and 2, lectures 3 and 4, lectures 5 and 6, and lectures 7 and 8. And in each one, the first of the pair introduces a certain issue and goes through that issue, and then the second element of the pair focuses on a particular paper that discusses that issue. The second lecture is also going to be a bit shorter. We're going to try to get some Zoom discussions going, and the second lecture will typically be about half an hour, a bit more, and then we'll have some Zoom back and forth, I hope. The first element of each pair, in other words, on theories of introspection and transparency, and so on, they will be for about an hour and a half or so. And this is lecture 1, theories of introspection. So let me now turn to the first of our topics, theories of introspection. Now, the first thing to say, of course, is that something just to reiterate that I said before, namely it's extremely confusing to know what it is that we're talking about when we talk about introspection, and it's also a bit confusing to know what a theory of introspection would be. And so we don't want to move too fast. I very much like the old adage that if it's not moving slowly, it's not moving. So we need here in particular, I think, to move quite slowly over these issues to make sure we know where we are. So let's begin with a simple example. So here is this is my cat Django. It's called Django, and here he is sitting outside in the sun. He's a kind of chocolate Burmese cat, and he's a major pain, let me assure you. You may see him because he may well interrupt me while I'm trying to deliver these lectures. But anyway, here he is. He's a beautiful specimen, as you can see. Now suppose that in this example I'm seeing him. Here it's just a picture of him, but imagine a case in which there it is, I'm seeing a cat. And I don't want you to imagine that anything special is going on. There aren't sort of lots of fake cats hanging around, or I haven't taken any, hallucinogenic drugs, or I haven't been influenced by any weird forms of propaganda or fake news or gurus or whatever. It's just a normal day, and I'm looking at the cat and I see the cat. So in that situation, it seems to be true that I see the cat, and it's also true that I know that I'm seeing the cat. I don't always know such things, of course, but in this particular example, I do know that I'm seeing a cat. So as we can say in this example, it's true that I'm seeing a cat, and it's likewise true that I know that I'm seeing a cat. And one way to think about our question, the question about introspection that we're going to be interested in, is this. How do I know this last thing? How do I know that I'm seeing a cat? I do know that. It's true that I'm seeing a cat, and it's true that I know that I'm seeing a cat. How do I know it? That's the question that we're going to be interested in. Now, there are lots of things that we can say about this thing that I know, the proposition. There's an issue as to what it is that you know when you know things at all, like if you know that there is a cat, or you know that you're seeing a cat. What are these things? I'm going to refer to them as propositions. So there is a proposition that I'm seeing a cat, and I know that proposition. And we can ask about certain things. We can ask about the properties of that proposition, what we can say about it. One thing we can say about that proposition is that it's at least partly about a cat. It's partly about Django in particular. There he is. It's also a first personal proposition. It's the proposition that I am seeing a cat. It's not the proposition that Daniel is seeing a cat. That may be true as well, and I may also know that. But this proposition is about me, intuitively. And it's about me that's seeing a cat. Thirdly, it's a present tense proposition. It's about what's currently happening. I am currently seeing a cat. Now I say I'm currently seeing a cat in some sense. The reason I say that is because it's a little hard to know whether what it means is are we just talking about a split second at which I'm seeing a cat, as if I caught a glimpse of a cat and then turned my head away? Or maybe I'm seeing a cat over some extended period that we might think of as the present for these sorts of purposes. That won't matter very much for us, so I won't go into that issue. But it is an interesting issue about what sort of temporal information is involved in a proposition such as that I'm seeing a cat. Thirdly, so the proposition is about a cat. It's a first personal proposition. It's a present tense proposition. It's also partly about some kind of psychological episode of some kind. Now, in a way that's obviously true, because it's about not just about a cat and about me, it's about my seeing a cat, and that you might think of as at least involves a sort of psychological episode. It's a bit, it's somewhat controversial actually in the philosophy of perception what psychological episode it involves. Maybe it's just the straight relation of seeing a cat, or maybe it's that when you see a cat, it typically seems to you that something is the case. For example, that there is a cat in front of you, and it might be true that if you took a drug and hallucinated that there was a cat, then all that would be the case is that it seems to you that there's a cat in front of you, but you don't literally see the cat because there isn't a cat for you to see in that kind of situation. But nevertheless, it's plausible to think that when you see a cat, there is some sort of psychological episode. Maybe it's it's seeming to you that there is a cat. That may happen whenever you see a cat. Again, that's a somewhat controversial issue, but I won't be going into that all that much. Let's just take it for granted that this involves a psychological episode of a certain kind. Okay, so finally, the proposition that I'm seeing a cat also has an important property, namely that it's a contingent proposition. It's not just first person or present tense, it's not just about cats and about psychology, it's also contingent. What do I mean by saying it's contingent? I mean, well, it's true. In fact, it has to be true, otherwise I couldn't know it. But it's contingent in the sense that it might have been false. How might I make that proposition false? Well, one way to make it false is to shut your eyes. If you're seeing a cat and you want to make it false that you're seeing a cat, you can shut your eyes, and then it's no longer true that you're seeing a cat. Maybe you remember seeing a cat, maybe you were seeing a cat, but it's not true that you are seeing a cat if you shut your eyes. So it's a contingent claim that I'm seeing a cat. It's something that's true, but it might not have been true. It might have been false. Now the question we're interested in is, how do I know this proposition? In the example, we've just presupposed that I know it. But the question is, how do I know that proposition? Well, it's a contingent proposition, so let's ask how we come to know contingent propositions normally. How do we come to know them? Now, you might ask that question in a kind of skeptical vein. You might think, well, maybe we don't know any contingent propositions. But of course, we don't think that's normally true. We think that we do know lots of contingent propositions. How is it that we know them? Well, a plausible general claim, we can assess this claim for truth or falsity, we can worry about whether it's true without exception and so forth, but an at least initial plausible general claim is that we come to know propositions like this in a way that depends either on perception or on inference, or perhaps both, some mixture of both. So some things that are contingent I seem to know through perception, in the sense of sense perception. I come to know via my senses. So, there's a wallet here on the desk. I know that there's a wallet on the desk. That's a contingent claim. It's a contingent proposition. I know that there's a wallet on the desk. It's true that there's a wallet on the desk, but it might not have been true. It's a contingent proposition. How do I know that? Well, I know it by perception. In other words, I see the wallet. I see the desk, perhaps. I see the relation between the wallet and the desk. And it's in virtue of all that I come to know that there's a wallet on the desk. So that's one way in which you can come to know contingent facts or contingent propositions, namely by perception. There are other ways in which you can know contingent facts too. Take various historical or scientific facts, for example, facts that seem to concern parts of the world that are not in my local environment, that are not perceptually available to me. Well, I know certain things about that as well. I know historical events, for example. How did I know them? Well, it's plausible to think on the face of it that I knew them from inference, perhaps from reading things in books or from hearing people talk about them or seeing historical dramas on television or something like that. And in effect, these are all modes of coming to know things by inference. So that's the other way in which we come to know things. We don't have direct perceptual acquaintance with them, but we come to know them by inference. And this seems to be a plausible generalization about how we come to know contingent facts in general, namely by perception or inference. But the thing is that I didn't come to know that I'm seeing a cat in either of these ways. That is not how I came to know that I am seeing a cat. I didn't come to know it through perception. And I didn't come to know it through inference. And yet I do know it. That was our starting point. I'm seeing a cat, and I know that I'm seeing a cat. So there must be some way that I know it. But it doesn't look as if I came to know it by perception or inference. So that we might now say that there must be some distinctive way that I came to know this thing. There must be a distinctive way, a way that's distinct from perception or inference. And we can use the phrase introspection or by introspection to capture this distinctive way. So you can say, I came to know that I'm seeing a cat by introspection. And by introspection there marks this distinctive way that I come to know this thing. Now, we've been using a particular example, that I am seeing a cat. But presumably the example, what we've just said about this example would apply in the case of many other things too, many other propositions as well. That I want a drink, for example, here's the drink. I knew that I wanted a drink. How did I know that? Not by perception or inference, or that you believe something. Suppose I believe that Sacramento is the capital of California. I know that that's true. I believe it. How did I know that I believe it? Well, not by perception or inference. Or again, suppose I'm angry at a failure to act on climate change. I know perfectly well that I'm angry about this. It's not news to me that I'm angry. But how did I know that I'm angry? Well, again, we could say it's not by perception or inference. And so in all of these cases, we can say, I know this by introspection. By introspection. So introspection is being used to mark some sort of distinctive way that I came to know these things. And more generally, we can say that introspection is that distinctive way that I know such things as that I'm seeing a cat, or that I want a drink, or that I believe that Sacramento is the capital of California. So that's what introspection is. That sort of, in a way, identifies what it is. It's a distinctive way that I come to know certain propositions of this kind. Now, let me say something about this way of introducing the notion of introspection. By the way, what I've just gone through is a kind of, I think, a pretty typical way in contemporary philosophy of mind of introducing the notion of introspection. And there's certain things that we should say about it. The first is that it's what you might think of as a kind of counter-etymological way of introducing the notion, or that overplays it slightly. It's not so much that it's counter-etymological, it's a way of introducing the notion that sort of ignores the etymology of the term. It's pretty clear just from the term introspect that it has something to do with inside, intro, inward, and spect means look. So it carries with it this idea of looking within. And the way in which I introduced the notion just then doesn't really, it doesn't have any commitment to that notion of looking within. It also doesn't repudiate any idea about looking within. Maybe, as we'll see later, we could take that more seriously. But certainly just the phrase, even though its etymology is a matter of looking within, there isn't a commitment to here. Likewise, I mean, think of there's another phrase in English, insight. Insight, if you might have an insight into a particular problem, that means you basically have a good idea about the problem. But the word insight is very closely related in certain ways to the word introspect. It doesn't mean the same thing in English. But we use that word again in a way without any particular commitment to looking in. It doesn't mean that, or looking within something. Actually, it's a very typical thing in English that it uses visual vocabulary. It uses visual vocabulary in a way that doesn't assume anything literally visual or perceptual. So in fact, insight is one example of that. We can have insight into a problem doesn't mean that we literally look within it. We also talk about retrospection. In retrospect, I could have done differently, you say. Or if you look into the past, that might be a case of retrospection. Nobody thinks that these literally involve looking or sense perception or something. Likewise, we often speak in English of seeing, let's say, seeing the force of an argument. It just means that you know the force of an argument, or you've come to know it or something. But there isn't any assumption that it's literally perceptual. So far, we've introduced the notion of introspection in a way that it just marks a particular way of coming to know something. But it's neutral with respect to whether we should take the perceptual overtones of that way, of that word seriously or not. There's also another feature of the way in which the word is used in English, which I want to mention, and notice that our way of thinking about the notion of introspection is independent of that. And that's, we often, in English, you often use the word introspect to mean an act of, usually an act of attention to something about yourself, perhaps your psychology. To introspect is to do that. The way that we've introduced the notion of introspection or by introspection so far hasn't prejudiced that issue either. It doesn't say, that when you come to know something by introspection, you must have attended inside or attended to anything for that matter. It doesn't say anything about that. It may require that, but there's nothing there's nothing in the way that we've introduced the word which pushes you in that direction, pushes you to think about introspection as an activity in that way. It's true that in English we have this verb to introspect, and you can use that word, but the phrase by introspection, which I've been using, doesn't require that particularly. Now, I've been saying that introspection is distinctive. It's a distinctive way of coming to know things like that I'm seeing a cat. And that means in part that I didn't know that fact by perception or by introspection. But I haven't said very much about why those claims are true. So let's look at this claim about perception. Why is it the case that when I come to know that I'm seeing a cat by introspection, why is it the case that I come to know that I'm seeing a cat by introspection rather than perception? Why don't I come to know this by perception? Well, there are a number of ways of trying to bring this out, or to try to make this clear. So one way is to contrast the proposition that I'm seeing a cat, that's the proposition we've been concentrating on, with a distinct proposition, namely that there is a cat. Now, this proposition that there is a cat is similar in some ways to the proposition that I'm seeing a cat. It's contingent as well. It mightn't have been true. It mightn't have been true that there is a cat. It's also similar insofar as it's about a cat, but it's not similar insofar as it's not about me. There's nothing first personal about it, and it's certainly not about any aspect of my psychology, or indeed anyone's psychology. Now, suppose it seems we could have said, when introducing the example, well, I not only know that I'm seeing a cat, I also know that there is a cat. I know that too. I know that there is a cat. And it's also true that there is a cat, and I know that there is a cat. That's also the case. How did I know that there is a cat? Well, in this case, it looks as if we've got at least the outlines of a natural answer to this question, and the answer is, well, I know that there's a cat by perception. How did I know that there's a cat? Well, I saw the cat. That's how. That's how I knew that there is a cat. But there is a cat is a completely distinct proposition from the proposition that I'm seeing a cat. They have different truth conditions, as philosophers say. That means that they're true under different conditions. That I'm seeing a cat entails something about me, something about my psychology. That there is a cat does not entail any such thing. So they're distinct propositions. And it seems clear that I came to know that there is a cat by perception, by sight. But I don't come to know that I'm seeing a cat in that same way. That's quite a distinct proposition. We can also hear, in thinking about why it's not the case that I come to know that I'm seeing a cat by perception, we can compare a case in which I did come to know that by perception. So imagine I catch a glimpse of myself in the reflection of a window, let's say, or a mirror, or something like that. I see myself, and I see a cat, and I can see that I'm seeing a cat. In that way, I could come to know that I'm seeing a cat by perception. I can see myself in the mirror, and I can see that in the mirror I'm seeing a cat. Therefore, I come to know that I'm seeing a cat. Well, in that case, I did come to know that I'm seeing a cat by perception. And here the situation is sort of completely analogous to situations in which I come to know that somebody else is seeing a cat. I can know that I'm seeing a cat, but I can also know that other people see cats too. I can come to know that you are seeing a cat, or some third party. Or take Taylor Swift. I could come to know that Taylor Swift is seeing a cat by perception. If I happen to see Taylor Swift seeing a cat, then I could come to know that she's seeing a cat, and I would come to know that by perception. So it's not to be doubted that I can do this. I can come to know of third parties that they're seeing a cat by perception. And on occasion, I could even come to know of myself that I'm seeing a cat by perception. For example, if I see myself in reflection. Okay. Um, but that's not what's going on in our example. In the example I asked you to imagine, all that was true is that there you are, looking at a cat. You know that there's a cat. You know that you're seeing a cat. How did you know that? Well, in this case, you didn't come to know it by perception. Maybe you came to know that there was a cat by perception. In fact, that seems extremely plausible. But you didn't come to know this distinct thing that you're seeing a cat by perception. Well, that's why you didn't come to know that you're seeing a cat by perception. But what about inference? Is it the case that you didn't come to know it by inference? Well, here we need to move quite slowly again. Now, inference is a word that can be used in various different ways. Sometimes it means any kind of transition, to use a phrase that some philosophers use. I learnt that from Peacock, Christopher Peacock. There's some sort of change of state or psychological state from one to another. And at least if you understand the notion of a psychological state broadly enough, then it's extremely difficult to deny that you came to know that you're seeing a cat by inference, in that sense of inference, in that there's just some change in psychological state. After all, when you see a cat, there's a huge amount of, computational processing going on. Perhaps there's a movement from one kind of psychological state to another. If that's all that you mean by inference, then it's pretty hard to say that you didn't come to know that you're seeing a cat by inference. And so from that point of view, you might think, well, why are you so sure that you didn't come to know that you're seeing a cat by inference? Well, the answer to this is that in this particular context, we are using a kind of specific notion of inference, where inference means a transition of a certain kind, but not just of any kind, of any shift from one psychological state to another, but one that involves a transition from a belief to another belief. And we do sometimes make inferences in this sense. So, for example, suppose I'm at our street here, Hobbs Street, has a Christmas party called Ho Ho Hobbs Street. Okay, and suppose I come to know that my neighbour is an accountant, or come to believe that my neighbour is an accountant. How did I come to know this? Because of the way he dances at the Christmas party. Only an accountant would dance that way, I say. So here's the example is, I say to you, my neighbour is an accountant. You ask me, how do you know, or why do you believe this? And I say, because of the way he dances at the Christmas party. Well, in this particular example, it seems to be the case that I move intuitively from a belief to another. Or maybe I moved from a kind of state of knowledge, one state of knowledge to another state of knowledge. But knowledge normally involves belief, or at least so I will assume. So it does involve a case of believing something and moving to another belief. So I believe that my neighbour is an accountant because I believe something about the way he dances, and perhaps about the way that accountants in general dance, something like that. That's the sort of notion of inference that I have in mind, a move from one belief to another. Actually, the way that you report this sort of thing in English is that you wouldn't normally mention the belief. You'd say, I believe that my neighbour is an accountant because of the way he dances. You don't, sounds as if you're just reporting a fact about how he dances. But I think what's going on in the background here is something like a transition from one belief to another. And that's why this is the sort of inference. This is then the notion of inference that we have in mind. Now, if that is the notion of inference that you have in mind, then it becomes very plausible to say that I didn't come to know that I'm seeing a cat by inference. Because after all, suppose that I did. Suppose I did come to know that I'm seeing a cat by inference. Then there would have to be some other proposition that I believe. And that other proposition is something from which I can infer that I'm seeing a cat. Rather, as if there are propositions about accountants and the way they dance. And from those propositions I can infer that my neighbour is an accountant. But there isn't any such proposition like that in our example, at least in the normal case. At any rate, that seems to be an initial assessment of the situation. There doesn't seem to be any particular belief that I had from which I inferred that I'm seeing a cat. Maybe it's not impossible that I infer that I'm seeing a cat in this way. That I don't think one should think it's impossible. Maybe, in fact, in the case in which I see myself in reflection, I might learn that, that person is seeing a cat and that person is me, so therefore I'm seeing a cat. One can certainly go through a process like that in principle. So it's not, the claim isn't that one couldn't come to know by inference that one is seeing a cat. But it's rather that this doesn't seem to be what's happening in this particular example. And moreover, it doesn't seem to be what's happening in the normal case either. In the normal case, it just doesn't seem to be that I come to know that I'm seeing a cat on the basis of inference. So then let's go back to our notion of introspection. Introspection, we said, is that distinctive way that I come to know such things as that I'm seeing a cat. And distinctive here means, well, not perception or inference. At any rate, at least as those are commonly understood. Why do I need to say not as those are commonly understood? Well, I say that because there are theories of introspection that say, as we'll see, there are theories that are called perceptual theories or inner sense theories. And then there are theories that are called inferential theories. And these theories tend to say that actually introspection is a kind of perception or is a kind of inference. And you might say, well, then how do they accept that there is even such a thing as introspection? Because doesn't the very notion tell us that it's not perception or inference? Well, the answer, I think, is that what those theories tend to say is that introspection is perception, but not of the usual sort, or it involves an inference, but not of the usual kind or of the distinctive kind, not of the kind that's typically involved in learning something by inference, or not a kind of perception that's typically involved in knowing something by perception. One wants to leave open that possibility as an account of what introspection is. So that's what introspection is. It's that distinctive way that I come to know that I'm seeing a cat, or that I want a drink, or I believe something about Sacramento. And by distinctive we mean not perception and not inference, at least as those things are commonly understood. But now we could ask something which I sort of hinted at before but didn't get to, namely, what is this class of what is the class of propositions that we can come to know in this distinctive way? I've given some examples, but we want to know, that I'm seeing a cat, that I want a drink, that I believe that Sacramento is the capital of California, and so forth. But can we say anything about this class of propositions? What's the scope? What's the scope of introspection? Well, as we've already seen, we've seen some distinctive things of the propositions we've looked at, all of them are first personal, all of them are present tense in the kind of slightly complicated way I mentioned, and all of them concern psychology in a certain sense. But there's another, I think, important feature of these propositions, and that is that they all concern a conscious state I'm in. So I've talked to you about introspection, and here the other element of the pair of topics that we're going to be talking about enters the picture. So on the face of it, I can come to know something by introspection, or some proposition by introspection. I can come to know that only if the proposition concerns a conscious state that I'm in. So, for example, in the case that we've been looking at, I know that I'm seeing a cat by introspection only if I consciously see a cat. Here I'm using the word consciously as an adverb. I see a cat, I see it in a certain way, namely consciously. I also use the notion here of a conscious state. So I think of these as equivalent, really. So there's the state of seeing a cat. That state can be conscious or not. That means it can either be true that you see the cat consciously or not. So you're in a conscious state of seeing the cat if and only if you consciously see the cat. So consciously seeing a cat and being in a conscious state of seeing a cat, I take to be equivalent things. But the important point here is that introspection seems to be a way that we come to know that we are in conscious states. It's conscious states that we come to know that we're in by introspection. So now we can add to our account of what introspection is by saying that introspection is that distinctive way, we've already talked about that, the distinctive way that we know that we're in conscious states when we're in them. This way of putting this notion says that introspection is a certain sense of way of telling us that we're in conscious states. Is it a way of telling us that those states are conscious? That's a further issue. That's got to do with the nature of the propositions that we come to know by introspection. I haven't decided on that issue. So far, we haven't settled that issue. But what is at least the case is that I can come to know that I'm seeing a cat by introspection only if my state of seeing a cat is conscious, only if it is true of me that I consciously see a cat. Likewise, I can only come to know by introspection that I believe that Sacramento is the capital of California, only if I consciously believe that. If I don't consciously believe it, then I can't come to know that by introspection. Now, in saying that I can, that introspection is a matter of coming to know that you're in certain conscious states, I'm of course not denying that you're in lots of unconscious states. In fact, I think it's an obvious psychological fact that we're very often in unconscious states. I don't think that's in any way a deniable fact. Often we have motivations or desires or beliefs or biases that are unconscious, and we are driven by these beliefs and desires or biases which are unconscious. Likewise, that seems like an obvious fact of folk psychology. Likewise, in cognitive science or linguistics, it's often an assumption that we know lots of things, or at least believe or cognize perhaps lots of things, but we do so in an unconscious way. We know the rules of our native language, for example, but in an unconscious way. So I take it to be obvious that we are in these psychological states. I also take these states to be, genuinely psychological states. Not all philosophers of mind will accept that, but I certainly accept that on the face of it. Now, these psychological states seem to me to be extremely interesting and important. Perhaps they're in some ways the most interesting and important psychological states that we can be in, since they certainly explain behaviors and are certainly real. But I think there's a sense in which they're not epistemologically interesting. And by that I mean when we come to know that we're in conscious states, when we come to know that we're in unconscious states, if I come to learn, for example, that I know some rule of my language, but that rule is unconscious. Well, I do so, when I come to know this, I come to know it by inference or perception. For example, from inference or perception from what a linguist might tell me about what rule that I'm following. I can come to know that. Or suppose I have a bias. To borrow an example of Christopher Peacock, suppose I have a bias against PhDs that aren't from my own country. I think this is his example. I can't remember. I'll make sure of it. But in any case, suppose if I'm on a selection committee, and I tend to give more weight to people whose PhDs come from my own country than from other people's countries. I have this bias, let's say, but suppose it's unconscious in the sense that perhaps I deny that I have it, but it's pretty obvious to the other members of the committee that I have this bias. Well, suppose I have this bias, and suppose I learn that I have this bias. A member of the committee, let's say the chair of the committee, tells me that I have this bias, and I come to believe that I do. Well, in that case, I come to believe that I have the bias by inference, clearly, or by perception. So I think unconscious states are not epistemologically interesting in the way that conscious states are, in the sense that there doesn't seem to be a distinctive way that we come to know them, or at least there doesn't seem to be any pressure to think that we come to know these things in this distinctive way. That isn't to say, by the way, that you can't come to know that you're in an unconscious state by inference from something that you know by introspection. That can also happen. For example, take a case in which I'm embarrassed about something. Sometimes, for example, if you can get embarrassed if you get praised in public for something that you've done. But you get embarrassed. You haven't done anything wrong, of course, but you get embarrassed. Now, what is it to be embarrassed? It's to sort of feel negatively about a social situation, to the extent that that situation involves the violation of a social norm or a social convention that you accept. So the reason that you would be embarrassed when you're publicly praised is maybe because there's a norm or convention that you accept, which would be a norm or convention of modesty, for example. You think that it's somehow immodest to be praised in this way. And that's why you feel embarrassed. Now, in that kind of situation, it can sometimes happen that you know perfectly well that you feel embarrassed, and you may know that you feel embarrassed by introspection. You know that you have a certain feeling by introspection. You also might be able to know that if you feel embarrassed, it must be that there's some norm that you accept where the situation that you're embarrassed by constitutes a violation of that norm. But it may be completely unobvious to you what norm it is that you accept. To accept a norm is in effect to believe something, let's say. So you don't know that you believe that this norm is the one that should be followed in the circumstance. Well, but you might come to know that by inference. You might come to know that you accept this norm as a matter of inference from knowing that you have a certain feeling and knowing that the feeling involves there must be this norm, and you think about it. So the idea is here that you feel embarrassed. There's a part of the embarrassment, the feeling, that you can come to know by introspection. But there's another part of something that's involved in embarrassment, namely that you accept a certain norm, which is unconscious. That would be possible. And so in that case, you might come to know something about your own psychology by inference, but not by inference from what other people say, but by inference from your own, from something that you already know by introspection. That can happen as well. But that, I think, doesn't quite make unconscious psychological states epistemologically interesting, at least not in the way that conscious states are epistemologically interesting. In fact, in a certain sense, what makes unconscious states interesting from a philosophy of mind point of view is that they are psychological states which you come to know about in a completely ordinary way and not an abnormal or anomalous way. Okay, so let's just recap. We've been talking about introspection as that way that we come to know, that distinctive way that we come to know that we're in certain conscious states. And we've noticed that while we might be in unconscious states, those states don't seem to have any specific epistemology. But what is the notion? But now we confront another question which is difficult, namely, what is the notion of consciousness that's at issue here? If we just go back a bit, if I go back. More generally, I said introspection is that distinctive way that we know that we are in conscious states when we're in them. Well, what is the notion of a conscious state that we have in mind here? To put it slightly differently, the way that I've been introducing the notion of introspection, it sort of presupposes that we have a grip on some notion of a conscious state, because introspection is that way that you come to know that you're in a conscious state if you're in it. Well, what is the notion of a conscious state? Well, there are various problems here because there are different notions of consciousness in the contemporary literature. I think it's reasonable to think that there's sort of three notions. For most purposes, it's reasonable to think that there's three notions. Here we're talking about consciousness. Here we're talking about the notion of a conscious state. And as I said before, that's very closely connected in my mind to the notion of the adverbial notion of consciously perceiving. To consciously perceive something is to be in a conscious state of perceiving it. So what is it for a state, a psychological state, like a state of seeing something or believing something or imagining something or desiring something? What is it for those states to be conscious? Well, there's a very well-known view that's sometimes called the higher order view, or sometimes the higher order thought view. And on this view, a psychological state is conscious if and only if you are aware that, or perhaps you believe that, you're in the state in a certain sort of way. In a certain sort of way means that that's supposed to qualify the way you came to believe that you're in the state. You came to believe that you're in the state in a certain sort of way. So, for example, in the case of seeing a cat, the idea is, well, that state is conscious on the higher order thought view because you see the cat and you believe that you see the cat in a certain sort of way. That's what makes that state conscious. And there's no doubt that in some ways of talking about consciousness, we have in mind the higher order thought view. But notice that it can't be this notion of consciousness that's involved in the little view about introspection that we've been developing. It can't be that when we say that introspection is that way that we come to know about conscious states when we're in them, it can't be that the notion of a conscious state that that is used there is consciousness in this higher order sense. That can't be right. Why not? Well, the reason is because the higher order view presupposes the notion of introspection. That's why. Why does it presuppose the notion of introspection? Because when you say on the higher order view, a psychological state is conscious if and only if you are aware that, or you believe that you're in the state in a certain sort of way. What does in a certain sort of way mean? It basically means by introspection. So a psychological state is conscious if you believe that you're in the state by introspection. So, for example, seeing a cat would be conscious on this view just in case you see the cat and you believe that you see the cat by introspection. But if that's the case, then we can't think of consciousness as it appears in the notion of introspection as understood in this higher order view. I think this notion of consciousness is often actually called introspective consciousness, sometimes monitoring consciousness, which is Ned Block's term. You can see why it's called introspective consciousness, because it effectively defines consciousness in terms of a case of belief or knowledge that is belief or knowledge by introspection. That's why it's introspective consciousness. And if you think of it that way, then it can't be that the notion of consciousness that's involved in the account of introspection, it can't be that that is this notion of consciousness. It isn't to say that this notion of consciousness may not have its place, maybe it does, but it can't be the one that's involved in this account of introspection that we've been interested in. Well, as I said, there are sort of three notions of consciousness, really. One of them is that higher order view. Another one, which is even more famous perhaps, is the phenomenal view. This is the one that mostly people are interested in philosophy philosophy of mind. And this one is normally introduced as, a psychological state is conscious just in case there is essentially something it's like, or some way it feels to be in the state. So that, for example, if I'm seeing the cat, then if there's something essential to the way it feels to me to see the cat, or that there's something it's like for me to see the cat in that sort of situation, then that state would be conscious in this phenomenal sense. Now, this sense doesn't face the problem I just mentioned. The problem I just mentioned about the higher order view and the notion of introspection is effectively that there's a kind of circularity. You can't say that introspection is that way that you distinctively come to know that you're in psychological states that are conscious, if by conscious you mean the higher order view, because the higher order view, it just means that a state is conscious if you come to know it by introspection, roughly speaking. Now, this view about consciousness doesn't face that problem at all, because there's no connection to the way something feels or the way it's like, which involves the higher order view. At any rate, what I just said isn't completely true, perhaps, because there are ways of hearing this phrase, something it's like, in a way that basically incorporates the higher order thought view. Certain defenders of the higher order thought view, like in particular David Rosenthal, who's the most prominent defender, I think would interpret the phrase something it's like in that way. But I think for most people that's not what they mean by this phrase something it's like. They really means that something constitutively connected to feeling, that you feel a certain way, and that a psychological state is conscious just in case you feel that way. And on the face of it, that does not seem to involve anything like introspective belief. So then, if we take this notion the phenomenal notion, we can kind of put this back into the idea of introspection, the definition of introspection that I've been operating with. Introspection is that, introspection is, let's go back again actually just to make sure we have it in front of us. Introspection is that distinctive way that we know that we're in conscious states when we're in them. What I'm looking at now is the proposal that conscious, in that account of conscious, of introspection, means phenomenally conscious, is that distinctive way that we know that we're in phenomenally conscious states when we're in them, states that essentially involve a certain kind of feeling. So that's a better proposal, but I think there's a kind of a worry here that it's sort of too narrow. And that's because it's unclear what sort of states are such that it's essentially, that there's some way it essentially feels to be in them. Certainly states of feeling are that sort. If you feel a certain way, then there's some way essentially that you feel. But there are lots of psychological states which on the face of it seem to be introspectively accessible and yet are not phenomenally conscious in this way. States of knowledge, perhaps desire, perhaps belief, perhaps intention. In all of these cases, it seems to be the case that if I consciously know something or believe something or intend something, I can come to know by introspection that I know or believe or intend these things. And yet it seems extremely speculative to say that they are phenomenally conscious in the sense that there's something essential. It's essential to those states that you must feel a certain way in order to be in them. Now, of course, some philosophers say that that is the case. There's a famous paper by David Pitt called What Is It Like to Believe That P?, where he's claiming that even for belief, there's some essential way it feels to be in the state. But I think that's a speculative proposal that may or may not be true. And if it's not true, as I personally don't think it is true, then that doesn't mean that we can't know by introspection that we believe things. That seems to be a kind of datum, that we know by introspection that we believe things. And so we don't want to define the notion of introspection in such a way that it's only going to tell us about phenomenally conscious states that we're in them. Maybe it should tell us about phenomenally conscious states. I think that is true, but I don't think it should tell us only about them. Now, of course, I mean, if Pitt, for example, is right and there is a certain kind of distinctive phenomenal character to belief, and other philosophers have argued similarly that there's such a thing as cognitive phenomenology, for example, that for cognitive states there's something it's like to be in them, then perhaps we don't need to worry about that. But it does seem as if we don't want to define the notion of introspection, or at least to understand the notion of introspection in advance of looking at these questions in such a way that it's only phenomenal states which are introspectively accessible. So I think we need a slightly broader notion as well. And there is a broader notion usually called access consciousness. Access consciousness is different from consciousness in the higher order sense because it doesn't involve a higher order belief, a belief about the state. But it also isn't limited to phenomenal consciousness. So on this view, a psychological state is conscious if and only if you are aware of the intention. One way to think about it is you're aware of the intentional object of the state in a particular way. So for example, in the case in which I'm seeing a cat, that state might be conscious if I'm aware of the cat, which in this case is the intentional object of the state, in a particular way. So notice how close this is actually to the higher order thought theory. On that theory, a psychological state is conscious if and only if you are aware that you're in the state in a particular way. Here we've got it's conscious in this access sense, if and only if you're aware of the intentional object of this state, of what the intentional object of the state means, what the state is about, in this case, the cat. I'm aware of the cat in a particular way. Now, what way? Well, that's a further issue for access consciousness. Maybe it means that I attend to the intentional object of the state in a particular way. Perhaps I attend to it to a sufficient degree, for example. Or perhaps I'm aware of it in such a way that the awareness has a certain kind of functional role. Perhaps it's to use a phrase that Ned Block uses, that it's poised to play a certain functional role rather than just having a certain functional role. Now, if we have a notion like this, a notion of access consciousness in this way, then we can apply it to any kind of state that we like. For example, if I know something, I consciously know it, or you consciously know it if you attend to what you know to a sufficient degree, perhaps in a way that makes your knowledge be poised to play its normal functional role. These are the notions of access consciousness. It's a sort of a functional, attentive, or attention-based notion of consciousness. We haven't looked very closely at what it is, but that's the idea. And this is a third notion. So we have the higher order thought view, or the higher order view, the phenomenal view, and the access view. And these are three different notions of consciousness. Now, this notion, the notion of access consciousness, is sometimes thought of especially in philosophy of mind and perhaps in certain parts of philosophy of psychology, to be the sort of poor cousin of consciousness studies. It's sort of like a kind of minor character. Sometimes people think of it as the sort of information processing shadow of phenomenal consciousness. That's a phrase that sometimes gets used. I think that probably isn't true, and we need this notion itself. It's a notion that we need it because we need to have a notion of consciousness which applies not just to phenomenal states, but to states that might not be phenomenal. And we need a notion of consciousness that isn't defined in terms of introspective belief. And this looks to be the notion that we can think about. Now, I'm not going to suggest here and now that this is how introspection should be defined. Maybe it should be defined in terms of a conscious state, where so long as the conscious state, the notion of consciousness at issue isn't higher order, that would be fine. But I think myself actually that ultimately it's best to operate uniformly with access consciousness, but I won't try to talk about that right now. Okay, so let me then recap a little bit with what we have got, what I've said so far. Well, we thought about introspection. Introspection is that distinctive way that I come to know things like that I'm seeing a cat, that I believe that Sacramento is the capital of California, and we've noticed certain things about it. One is that it seems to be not perceptual or not inferential in certain ways of understanding those notions at any rate. And it seems to concern psychological states insofar as they are conscious. Of course, we're in unconscious states, but those states, the unconscious ones, don't seem to raise this distinctive epistemological question in quite the same kind of way. And we've also been discussing the issue of what notion of consciousness can be invoked in the notion of introspection. And as I said, it's very hard to invoke a higher order thought notion because that seems to commit us to a certain kind of circularity. It's open to us to talk about phenomenal consciousness here, and while it's certainly the case that we can come to know that we're in phenomenally conscious states when we're in them by introspection, it's unclear that that gives a kind of a complete account, because there are non-phenomenal states which we always also seem to know that we're in by introspection. That leads us to a sort of notion of access consciousness, which, as I said, is sort of sometimes thought of as the sort of poor cousin, but actually I think it might play a more fundamental role. But anyway, we'll see all that. Now, we might ask at this point whether there are other things that we can come to know in this distinctive way. So maybe we can come to know propositions like I am in state S, where S is some conscious state, perhaps an access conscious state, or perhaps a phenomenally conscious state. But can I come to know other sorts of propositions too, other things? Well, yeah, I think sometimes people do think along these ways. Some potential examples might be, I can know what the psychological states are. So in addition to knowing that I'm seeing a cat, maybe I can come to know something that might be described as what seeing is, or what it is to see a cat. Likewise, I might be able to come to know how certain psychological states relate to each other. Like might come to know, for example, by introspection, that, pains are worse than itches, let's say, or more bothersome than itches. I know that pains are more bothersome than itches. How did I come to know that? Perhaps by introspection, by the same distinctive way. Sometimes people suggest that you can come to know not just what the psychological states are and how they might relate to each other, but what their essence is, which means the sort of totality of their essential properties. So in addition to knowing, what an itch is, maybe the idea is that I can come to know by introspection the essence of what an itch is. What philosophers might think of as the real definition. I can come to know that definition by introspection. And then sometimes people think that one can also come to know non-psychological facts in this same way. Like take, for example, here's a non-psychological fact. I'm raising my arm. That's not a psychological fact. That might involve a psychological fact. How do I know that I'm raising my arm? Maybe you could go through an analogous kind of argument to the one that we've gone through. I don't seem to know it by perception or by inference. Maybe there's a distinctive way. Maybe it's the same way. Or take a case in which I know certain things about my language. I know that, for example, the word rabbit means rabbit in my mouth, or perhaps more generally that I mean rabbit by rabbit. After all, that's contingent as well. It could have meant, the word rabbit, after all, could have meant anything. So it's a contingent fact that the word rabbit means rabbit. But how do I know that fact? Again, you might think, well, I don't know it by inference or by perception in any obvious way. So maybe I come to know it in this introspective way. Well, I'm not going to take up these further issues for the most part. I will talk quite a bit about the one about the essence, because that is the topic of revelation, which we will turn to. If I just go, maybe this was a mistake, if I just go back to this, here we're doing Lecture 1, Theories of Introspection. If we look at Lecture 5, Introspection and Revelation, revelation is precisely the idea that you can come to know not just that you're in a certain psychological state, but what the essence of the state is by introspection. And that's going to be the topic of Lecture 5. Going back to where we were. But mostly I'm not going to talk about these extensions, certainly not going to talk about extensions about, knowing that you're acting, knowing that your words mean what they mean, and so forth. Okay, so let me then turn to the question, the last thing I want to discuss in today's lecture, which is what is a theory of introspection. We've seen in outline what introspection is. It's a distinctive way that I come to know certain things. But what is it to provide a theory of introspection? Well, I'm going to take it that when you provide a theory of introspection, what you provide is some information about the distinctive way that we have of knowing about conscious states. That is, information about that way, what it is, how it works, how it's different from other sources of knowledge, more stereotypical versions of perception or inference, for example. And what that means is that we're just looking for some information about that. I'm not presupposing that the theory of introspection needs to take the form of a definition or a reductive analysis or something. That, I think, isn't what we should be looking for. We should, by a theory of introspection, we just simply mean a sort of an account or a picture of what it is that this way is. I've introduced it as that way that we distinctively come to know these things, or that distinctive way, that we come to know these things. Well, what is it? What is that way? That's what a theory of introspection is. And the philosophical literature, both in the contemporary literature, and also if we look back in the history of philosophy of mind, basically we've got a huge variety of different theories of introspection. And as I said right at the beginning, we're not going to be able to cover all of these. We're going to just look at some of them. And so in the rest of today's lecture, what I want to do is to give you a kind of tour through some of these, in particular the ones that we're going to be interested in. So first we have the notion of what are usually called inner sense theories or perceptual theories. The idea is that inner sense contrasts with outer sense. Outer sense are things like vision, touch, so forth. Inner sense is a sense by which we know our own minds. Now, as I said, the notion of introspection that we've been operating with is sort of counter-etymological. It sort of doesn't pick up on the overtones, the linguistic overtones of the word introspection, to look inside. So the label itself doesn't prejudice this. But as I also said, it doesn't say that you can't have a perceptual model, and that's precisely what a perceptual model does. It takes that language and treats it literally, at least literally up to a point. There are really two kinds of theories here, and this distinction is due to Sidney Shoemaker. There's a kind of theory which Shoemaker calls an object perceptual theory, and then there's a kind he calls a broad perceptual theory. What an object perceptual theory does is that it treats introspection as a kind of perception in a way that's analogous to vision, so that I come to know that, I believe that Sacramento is the capital of California. In fact, this is Shoemaker's example. In somewhat in the way that I come to know that there's a wallet on the table. That is, in the case in which I come to know that there's a wallet on the table, I see the wallet, I can focus on it, I can distinguish it from other things on the table, and that enables me to come to believe that there's a wallet on the table. Likewise, according to the object perceptual theory, the belief that Sacramento is the capital of California is likewise an object of inner perception for me. I can distinguish it from other things, I can attend to it, and this enables me to come to believe that I'm in it. That's what's called an object perceptual theory. There's also what Shoemaker calls a broad perceptual theory, and this theory doesn't think of inner sense as analogous to vision exactly. All it really says is that there's an empirical law-like connection between our being in a conscious state and believing that we are. This theory is really developed by David Armstrong, and Armstrong called it an inner sense theory. It's a little bit unclear actually as to why it's properly called an inner sense theory, and we'll turn to that a bit in next time. But in general, I take these theories to be important, and certainly historically important, but not really viable theories, and that's because I think Shoemaker has criticized them adequately. Nevertheless, I think the second one, the broad perceptual theory, is a theory that is very close to the truth in certain ways, and the theory that I ultimately like is a sort of thing that, logically speaking, looks a bit like a broad perceptual theory. But in any case, we're going to consider these theories in some length in Lecture 2. Well, in addition to inner sense theories, there's also a category of theory I'll call an acquaintance theory. And the basic idea of that theory is that conscious states have a distinct epistemology because they have an epistemological element built into them, owing to the fact that it's a necessary truth that when you're in a conscious state, you're acquainted with being in that state. So acquaintance is supposed to be a kind of, not exactly a perceptual notion, but a kind of almost perceptual notion, which when we're in a conscious state, we bear to that state, or at least bear to the fact that we're in the state. And it's this epistemological element that's built in right in the very notion of a conscious state that explains our introspective access to conscious states. Now, this theory, I think, could be thought of as akin to a perceptual model. Acquaintance in some ways is like a perceptual notion, but it's importantly different as well, and that is that it treats the relation between consciousness and acquaintance as necessary and not contingent. If you think of the relation between my seeing the wallet and the wallet, that seems to be a contingent relation. I could, I might see the wallet and I can't exactly see the wallet and there isn't a wallet, but it can be the case that it's perceptually like I'm seeing a wallet even if there isn't a wallet. And of course, there could be a wallet even if I'm not seeing it. So the connections here seem to be contingent. On the acquaintance view, the connection between conscious states and acquaintance is not contingent. There's sort of two elements built in. And this theory is a kind of an extremely popular theory in contemporary philosophy of mind. Actually, it's defended by lots of people, by Brie Gertler, who I've got on the reading list, by Martina Niederrummelen, who I'm going to look at right at the end of the lectures, and by a number of other people as well. And this will be also important in the later lectures. So we'll turn to that. So this is a very different kind of theory. It's a very, as I say, it's a very popular theory, and in some ways it's rather like a perceptual model. In other ways, it's not like a perceptual model. There's also what I'll call simple theories. Simple theories say that conscious states, we just noticed that acquaintance theories say that there's something called acquaintance, which is kind of built into a conscious state, and it's in virtue of that conscious states have a sort of distinctive epistemological role. Simple theories sort of say the same thing except for the acquaintance bit. So they say that conscious states have an epistemological element built into them, but just as such, this epistemological element explains our introspective access, but it's not because we're acquainted with these states, it's just because we're in the states. I'm not going to talk much about this theory. It's been defended in detail in a recent book by Declan Smithies called The Epistemic Role of Consciousness. It's a terrific book. I'm not going to talk much about this theory except by implication, and that's partly because a lot of what I have to say about the acquaintance theories will also apply to the simple theories. Both of these theories are similar insofar as they're very, very focused on phenomenally conscious states. Acquaintance theories say that it's phenomenally conscious states that we're acquainted with. They don't think that we're acquainted with conscious states in the other senses of consciousness that I imagined, or that I mentioned. I'm sorry. Likewise, the simple theories think that it's phenomenally conscious states that's the crucial thing. And that means that both of these theories have a kind of scope issue because, as I mentioned, it seems to be a fact that we can come to know that we're in non-phenomenally conscious states by introspection, and that's always going to be a bit of an issue as to how to deal with that if your basic theory is built around phenomenally conscious states. There are various ways to deal with this. It's not a sort of killer blow or anything, but it's certainly an issue, and I think that theories that don't have that restriction built into them tend to be more attractive for that reason. There are also inferential theories. Inferential theories say that we come to know that we're in conscious states by inference, and what's distinctive about introspection is just that the inferences are of a non-standard kind. So just as a perceptual model might say what's distinctive about introspection is that the perception involved is of a non-standard kind, likewise an inferential view might say that what's distinctive about introspection is that the inferences involved are of a non-standard kind. Now, I think that there's certainly something right about an inferential view, and that's because it seems correct to say that in many cases we do come to know that we're in psychological states by inference. I gave an example before of the example of embarrassment, where you come to know by introspection that you feel a certain way, and then you come to infer that you accept a certain social norm that you didn't know before, and that was coming to know that you're in that a certain psychological fact obtains, and you come to know that by introspection. Sorry, by inference. Likewise. I mean, another way to put this is to use a distinction that David Armstrong uses between what he calls aided and unaided introspection, or perception, as he sometimes puts it, where unaided introspection is introspection of the kind that we're talking about, where we come to know that we're in a conscious state by introspection. But if we know that we're in a conscious state by introspection, we can always infer that we're in certain other states, and then we're going to come to know that by inference. And that isn't exactly by introspection, but it might be thought of as by a case of aided introspection or something. So I certainly think there's something right about inferential theories. The question is whether they're exhaustive, that is, whether they can give an account of even the straightforward case where you come to know that you're seeing a cat, for example, by introspection. That doesn't on the face of it look inferential, so why is it exhaustive? And that view has been defended in detail by Alex Byrne. Finally, there's a bunch of theories called constitutive theories. Constitutive theories say that conscious states are self-intimating, and that means that there's this necessary truth that says that if you're in the conscious state and certain background conditions obtain and you're rational, then you'll believe that you're in them. This is an idea that Sidney Shoemaker in particular advances. We're going to look at Shoemaker in the next lecture, and he says that there are self-intimating factors, which means that if you're in a conscious state and certain background conditions are met and you're rational, you'll believe that you're in the state, and that's a sort of necessary truth. That's the theory that he advances, and he advances that as an improvement over the inner sense theories that he rejects. I like Shoemaker's view, as we'll see. I think there's an issue for Shoemaker's view, and that is what is the notion of rationality that he has in mind. If you understand rationality in a relatively narrow way, then I think a view of this kind is not that plausible. And if you understand it in a broad way, then I think it's not going to be a constitutive theory in the way that Shoemaker wants. And then finally, there's a theory, I think I said finally about constitutive theories. What I meant was there are constitutive theories and then there are these rationalist theories. A rationalist theory says that there are these rules of rationality, such as, it points out that there are rules of rationality, for example, such as a no contradiction rule. It seems irrational to believe that, irrational to have contradictory beliefs, something like that. You shouldn't, in other words, a rational agent should not have contradictory beliefs. A rational agent should believe the obvious consequences of their beliefs and so forth. And then the question arises whether we can extend that. And according to the rationalist view, the answer is yes, we can extend it to what we might think of as an introspective rule, something like if you're in a conscious state, then believe that you're in the state. And now the idea is something like, well, if you abide by the rule and then you're in the conscious state, then you'll have a certain rational disposition, namely to believe that you're in it, given certain conditions. And that may be the account of introspection. Both the constitutive theory and the rationalist theory emphasize the notion of rationality. What the rationalist theory does that's a bit different from the constitutivist theory is that it builds introspection and consciousness into the content of rationality. It says that rationality involves this rule that involves consciousness. Well, I'm not going to, this is a kind of mini tour through these different theories. I'm not going to go into all these theories today, but what we're going to do is next time I'm going to focus on next time I'm going to focus on I sort of lost the thing, I'm sorry. Next time we're going to have a look at Shoemaker's theory and Shoemaker's criticisms of the inner sense view, and we'll see why I said before that the inner sense view is kind of historically important but no longer plausible. Okay, well I'll talk to you again next time.